Hello, everyone, and welcome to MOSAICS' fourth quarterly webinar. I'm Zoe Root, the lead attorney of the MOSAICS initiative, which is funded by the Office for Victims of Crime. Here is our disclaimer assuring you that the content of this webinar is in no way represents the position of the Department of Justice. MOSAICS is dedicated to providing training and technical assistance to court stakeholders on how to best identify and assist survivors of sex and labor trafficking who are facing criminal charges. Our initiative is supported by a board of human trafficking criminal legal system experts and survivors. Our training and technical assistance is totally free. We personalize the content of the training and technical assistance to the specific needs of the court jurisdiction we are working with. If you are interested in receiving training and technical assistance, please contact us at mosaics@american.edu. Today's webinar is focused on the intersection of drugs and human trafficking. We chose this topic because drugs are intimately tied to the ways that survivors of trafficking are criminalized. In addition, misunderstandings about the ways drugs are used to coerce and control survivors exacerbate the harm that survivors experience when they are ensnared by the criminal legal system. So today we'll discuss how substance use disorders intersect with human trafficking, how different types of traffickers use drugs in victimization, and court responses and connections to services. We're so glad that you joined us today, and we're looking forward to discussing this really important topic. It's also really important for me to emphasize that while MOSAICS is dedicated to raising awareness about the criminalization of both sex and labor trafficking survivors, this particular webinar unfortunately only touches on labor trafficking briefly. That's because there is simply not a lot of information on the intersection of drugs and labor trafficking. But it's important to mention that just because there is not a lot of information about the intersection of drugs and labor trafficking, that does not mean it's not a problem. We know that sex trafficking survivors are often forced to sell drugs, and the forced sale of drugs always constitutes labor trafficking. Our presenter, Allison Franklin, will discuss that more later on. In addition, there's preliminary research that suggests that forced sale of drugs as a source of labor trafficking is an issue particularly among homeless youth. For example, a 2017 study by Loyola University's New Orleans Modern Slavery Research Project found that of the homeless youth population who were victims of labor trafficking, 81% reported being forced to sell drugs. So it's very clear that the intersection of drugs and labor trafficking is an issue that necessitates further research and allocation of resources. And we hope to be able to present on that research once it has been completed. I also want to note that one of the side effects of working from home is that all of our quote-unquote coworkers are hanging out with us, including my 11-week-old baby. So apologies if you can hear him crying in the background. So we also chose this topic for our fourth webinar because we have 3 training and advisory board members who are incredibly knowledgeable on this topic. Over the course of the webinar, you'll hear from Allison Franklin, Megan Ludstrom, and Charlotte Weber. They have tons of content to present to you here. Please also note that additional resources can be found on the Handouts tab. So without further ado, here's Charlotte Weber to start us off discussing how substance use disorders intersect with human trafficking.
Thank you, Zoe, and thank you, MOSAICS, for inviting me to present today. I'll also make a similar disclaimer that my neighbor is doing some construction at the moment, so hopefully it won't be too loud. She may hear some drilling and hammering while I'm speaking. Okay, so in this first section of the webinar, we're going to take a look at how substance use and substance use disorders intersect with human trafficking. So we'll start by sort of grounding everything in a trauma lens and looking at substance use as a trauma response. And then we will talk about substance use both as a source of control and a source of recruitment in trafficking. And then we will close out this initial section by talking about how substances are also a source of criminalization for survivors. Okay, so I wanted to start off today by really emphasizing that you can't talk about trafficking without talking about trauma. And you can't really talk about substance use without talking about trauma. If you're working with someone who has been trafficked or exploited, or you suspect that this is part of their history, then you already know that this is someone who likely has a significant history of interpersonal trauma. And then on top of that, I know many of you are working in the criminal legal system in some capacity, and we're talking today about working with survivors in the justice system. And so it's important to recognize that the experiences of being arrested and incarcerated and going in front of a judge and just having an open case in criminal court are significant traumas for the survivors that we're working with as well. And sort of more broadly than an individual case that you may be involved in, we're really in the midst of a national reckoning with racism and violence in the criminal justice system. And when we're doing this work, we have an obligation to recognize the traumatic impact of systemic racism and oppression on survivors, right? We have an obligation to recognize how that is enacted through the justice system. Maybe even particularly when we're talking about folks with substance use concerns, because of the ways that drug charges have been used specifically to criminalize and incarcerate Black and brown people in the US. And so it's imperative when we're doing this work that we are listening to survivors and that we believe survivors and that we are honoring and validating their responses to trauma, and not just interpersonal trauma, right, which I think is what we tend to think of first, right, like violence perpetrated by a single person, but also to systemic trauma and oppression as well. We're not doing a deep dive into trauma today, so I did want to say if you don't have any sort of foundational training in trauma responsiveness, I really recommend that you seek that out. There's a lot of great training being offered right now. We have another webinar actually through MOSAICS that's available on YouTube for free that it goes more into just understanding trauma and trauma responses. And if anyone is interested, at the end, I can suggest like books or other places to start your learning if you haven't had a chance to get any training. And really, you know, we should all be continuing our learning throughout the work. So substance use is linked to trauma, right? The research shows over and over again that trauma histories are prevalent among substance users. I would say in my work with survivors, 100% of my clients had complex trauma histories. And by complex, I mean multiple repeated and varied traumas that they had experienced over the course of their lifetimes. I think it's also worth noting that trauma history might specifically include early exposure to substance use. So I've worked with folks who started using like cocaine as young as 11 or 12 because addiction was in their family, and that's something that they were exposed to very early on. And then unfortunately, substance use is likely to increase the risk of experiencing further trauma, whether that's because of sort of a reduced ability to care for yourself or engaging in risky activities because of the substance use or to support the substance use. Okay, so to further illustrate the link between childhood experiences of trauma and subsequent development of a substance use disorder, I just wanted to highlight some research from ACEs here, which you may have heard of before. ACEs stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences, and this was a very large study that was initially done in the 90s, but it's since been replicated multiple times and with more diverse study groups. And essentially, it was looking at exposure to childhood trauma and subsequent mental and physical health outcomes in adulthood. And two things that I wanted to highlight from this research are, one, trauma is very common, and two, higher ACE scores had a direct correlation both to earlier onset of drug and alcohol use as well as to development of a substance use disorder. I believe it was like each ACE score, each adverse experience increased that likelihood by 2 to 4-fold. And one of the reasons why that's occurring is because traumatic experiences have a direct impact on brain development. And so if a child is experiencing chronic trauma, they may have changes in their cognitive functioning. They might have an impaired ability to cope with stress or negative emotions even outside of a traumatic experience. And there's a link here if you want to read more of the summary from SAMHSA about that research. Okay, so again, we're not doing a deep dive into trauma, but I did want to highlight 4 really common responses to trauma, just to sort of further show you how they translate into substance use. And if there's one thing I want you to remember when we're talking about trauma responses, it's that they make sense in the context of trauma, right? So oftentimes when we meet with people, we might see their responses, right? We see their behaviors or their reactions, but we don't know their trauma history, right? We don't know their personal histories or their stories. And so what happens is trauma responses get overlooked, or they get misdiagnosed as symptoms of mental illness, or otherwise pathologized or criminalized. And so when we're doing this work, we really want to be normalizing trauma responses and providing psychoeducation to survivors, if that's within your role, that trauma responses are adaptations to survive, right? They're normal and they make sense when we link them back to the context of trauma. Okay, so 4 of these responses are hypervigilance or hyperarousal, is essentially the body's way of constantly being prepared for danger. So a lot of the survivors that I worked with might describe feeling like really jumpy or edgy or always looking over your shoulder, or feeling paranoid, which, to be clear, it's not paranoia like in the psychiatric sense, but a lot of people have described it to me that way just because there's sort of this constant perception of threat, right? And it's essentially being in a chronic state of fight or flight. So this makes it really difficult to relax or to feel at ease. It can negatively impact sleep. And for many survivors that I've worked with, they didn't have access to an internal feeling of safety, right? For some folks, that feeling or even like the concept of safety was not accessible to them. Okay, so intrusive thoughts are unwanted and unexpected thoughts or memories related to the trauma. They may be triggered by something, they might come at random, but they are very intense and unpleasant, and they can sort of immediately change somebody's internal emotional state. Avoidance is exactly that. It's avoiding feelings or reminders related to the trauma. So an example that I used to give to clients was if you were robbed on your way home from work, you might start taking a different route home after that, right? Even though the new route home is 10 blocks out of your way and obviously takes longer to get home, and even though it's not likely that you'll be robbed again in the same place where that trauma initially happened, right? But you take the new route home because walking past that block where you experienced the trauma is too much. It's too overwhelming, and it brings up too much related to the trauma. And then lastly here, dissociation is a form of a freeze response. So I mentioned fight or flight. You've probably heard about a fight or flight response. Maybe you've heard about fight, flight, freeze. Freeze is a response that happens as often as fight or flight in the moment of a trauma. And dissociation is a form of a freeze response wherein you're essentially disconnected from your physical and conscious self, right? And this is a response that enables you to survive something that you can't escape and that would otherwise be intolerable, right? So you're disconnecting from that experience. It's something that may be started sort of intentionally to survive something really horrific, but when it's repeated over time, especially in childhood, it can also become an involuntary response. So I know that was a very quick run through of some complex trauma responses, but when you think about these responses, can you think about ways in which substance use might mimic a trauma response or otherwise be a way to cope with a traumatic experience, right? So substance use could be a way to regulate hyperarousal, right? It can make you feel calm and relaxed when that feeling isn't accessible to you. It could help you sleep. It could mute intrusive thoughts. And it's a really effective way to avoid feelings related to trauma or to totally disconnect from your present experience in order to survive it. So with that trauma lens in mind, I would encourage you moving forward to reframe substance use as a trauma response, meaning that it makes sense in the context of trauma. And though it may be harmful, it is nonetheless an adaptation to survive, right? This is a coping mechanism to cope with trauma. If we are approaching working with folks with substance use concerns from this perspective, we're going to have more effective engagement. Because if you meet with someone and you ask them what happened to you, which might look like, what is this person's history? Where did substance use start for them? How is it harmful? How is it helping them? And what are they telling me that they need, right? As opposed to meeting someone and asking what's wrong with you, which I think very often looks like this person has a charge for possession, they have an addiction, and they need drug treatment, right? Those are going to be two very different interactions. And when we're using a trauma lens, we're going to do a better assessment because we'll be curious about someone's needs and their history, right? We don't assume that we know what they need, and we'll be emphasizing survivors' resiliencies. And that all translates into better connection, and that's where we need to start. So I'll kind of close out this first portion here by just reminding you that when we're working with survivors of trafficking, whether there are substance use concerns or not, the initial focus has to be on building connection and increasing safety, right? Without those things, we can't do any other work. We can't like skip ahead before we build that connection with someone. And so with that, I will turn it over to Megan.
Awesome, thank you. This is Megan Lundstrom, and I'm going to just be talking through, let me see if I can move this to the next, there we go. Talking through how substances are used as a source of recruitment and how different types of traffickers utilize substances and existing substance use disorders to maintain control over their victims. So what we know from existing studies is that substance use disorders can come before entry into the sex trade or sex trafficking situation, but we also know that it's very bi-directional, and I'll talk a little bit about that during this section as well, in that sometimes individuals will enter the sex trade or a sex trafficking situation, and then a substance use disorder develops after that point. So when we're looking at vulnerabilities, particularly around individuals that have experienced substance use disorders or are in active addiction, there's a lot of other things at play while they are battling that disorder. So loss of legalized employment, as an example, substances make it very hard to be consistent, to show up on time, to have consistent behavior within a workplace. So individuals oftentimes lose their employment as a result of that substance use disorder. Similarly, weakened family and social ties can occur where relationships get damaged, communication and isolation occur. Lack of stable housing, so again, inability to maintain stable housing due to substance use disorder. And then all of those things, kind of that root issue of poverty and economic instability. An existing criminal record can make finding employment and housing very difficult. And so it creates kind of a vicious cycle for individuals with substance use disorder history. And then finally, just that dissociative power of substances. as a direct service provider, we walk alongside survivors, and a vast majority, 90+%, have a history of substance use, and the perceptions of what's happening versus what is happening can just exacerbate some of those symptoms, trauma symptoms like hypervigilance, and can make it very difficult for somebody to feel safe in whatever space that they're in. So it's important to recognize that traffickers will actively seek out and recruit from known or suspected users. Individuals with an existing substance use disorder are a very high-risk population for exploitation. Oh, I'm going to hand that off. Sorry, I'm going too far.
All right, sorry about that. I was on mute. So just to draw on the previous information, just understanding that relationship between trauma and substance use, it's critical to understand how traffickers use drugs as a form of control. They capitalize on those vulnerabilities to control and manipulate their victims. It's just they maximize that vicious cycle of violence, mental health issues, victimization, and secure attachment issues. And they can literally hijack the biology and the mind of their victims with drugs. And so it's critical to note in all the work that I do, and I am a survivor of trafficking. I was gang trafficked for nearly a decade, and I've been doing this work for about a decade as well. Nearly every single person that I work with that is a survivor of trafficking has a profound history of childhood sexual abuse. And so oftentimes, not every time, just as was mentioned, it's a way to mitigate those trauma responses. And that's exactly what traffickers do. They prey on vulnerabilities. So Pimp tactics are very similar to those used on prisoners of war. They restrict access to information. They cut off communication with family and former friends. They convince victims that they are dirty and can never go back to their old life. Make victims dependent upon their trafficker for all their material needs. Withhold food and sleep as forms of punishment, and extreme violence tempered with small acts of kindness. Substance use makes all this easier. An introduction of drugs into the equation makes isolating victims incredibly easy. They use drugs to isolate, offering enough drugs to create or support drug dependency. Just encourages victims to become more absorbed in getting high or escaping their trauma responses. Many don't seek an opportunity to engage with the outside world due to being hyper-focused on changing the way that they feel. So victims quickly and ease away from maintaining any kind of contact with their familiar friends or family or even ordinary activities as substance use increases. So it's just, weakening those family and social ties. So resulting from that substance use, it actually helps traffickers create the perception that that person is unworthy. So they actually have an ability to control the perceptions even with the drug use and abuse. Most victims, including myself with substance abuse issues or prior ones, have self-destructive thoughts and behaviors, self-contempt, feelings of shame and worthlessness resulting just from substance use. So that actually helps the traffickers control this perception that it's a choice and cured by the victim's own violation, ensuring that victims will willingly self-isolate. Most of the victims and survivors that I work with, oftentimes due to that abuse prior to being trafficked, not all, but most, their self-worth was decimated prior to being trafficked, and that substance use contributes to the self-perception. So traffickers maximize on controlling that perception by using the victim's dependency on drugs as a mean of power and control. Humiliation, too, based on their substance use, aids in that feedback loop that supports the trafficker's ability to control the victim's perception of self in the outside world. Even my own trafficker would encompass many humiliating tactics, calling me a dope fiend or a crackhead or a junkie. Nobody wants a drug addict. Look at you, you're disgusting. This is why you can't make enough money. Just those types of humiliating comments and etc. So even threats to remove access to drugs is a huge motivator for compliance. If you don't make this much money, you don't get any drugs. If you don't obey me, you only get so much drugs. And it's, for me, drugs and most of the people that I work with was a means to survival. It made that moment livable. And I often share personally that if I had not had drugs, I probably would have committed suicide. And so when a trafficker owns that means to your survival, he literally has that ability to demonstrate his supremacy. So he has the power to take away drugs and give you drugs, and that's the power to remove your means to survival. And that was my way to cope with my horrid reality. Enforcing trivial demands in effort to gain access to drugs, so that constantly chasing drugs, waiting for the access, the abusive comments, the lack of sleep, it's all exhausting, and it's all to the means to be controlled by the trafficker. It's also used to exhibit occasional acts of kindness, just throwing out drugs for use to victim aids the trauma bonding process. I see that especially as a barrier for individuals attempting to exit the life. Not just the trauma bonding, but the substance use and that tied to their trafficker. And so it's also a way to incite victims to make more money, induce loyalty. And as I mentioned, those acts of kindness is exactly what we hold on to make those moments livable. And then in turn, they can be used to demand payment for debt. So withholding drugs can cause victims to suffer pain, physical and mental withdrawal symptoms, and just yet another way to punish and control. And traffickers, they're experts. They're experts on identifying those inadequacies and deficiencies. And as mentioned before, some are so adept that they can literally create those vulnerabilities, including substance use, and exploit the victims on the very weaknesses that they created. So they strategically use a variety of methods to control their victims, all of which exacerbate the mental health, behavioral health, and in turn substance abuse issues. So it's just a repeated cycle of abuse and victimization. And the more abuse that victim incurs, the more mental health issues, self-perceptions, and worldviews are compromised. And more likely they're going to look for anything to change the way that they can feel. And so that victim's substance abuse or use can actually become a linchpin and cornerstone that dominates all the tactics used by traffickers for control. So not only did my trafficker groom me to be his property and prostitute, he actually groomed me to recruit other victims, purchase, sell, and take penitentiary risks for the drugs that he sold. As I mentioned, I was gang trafficked for nearly a decade, highly organized crime, and just for reference, anything to do with guns or drugs, money, cars, all of it, we moved it. All the while, I was groomed and set up to completely insulate my trafficker from any type of criminal justice involvement. I currently work extensively in the area of victim offender overlap with juveniles and adults. I actually do support groups in the state juvenile correctional facility. Most of the kids in there are very high offending, attempted murder, capital murder, robbery, some as young as 13. A large portion are in there on crimes their trafficker committed or they committed while under the oppression of their trafficker. So 90% of trafficking victims support survivors. Let me restate that. 90% of trafficking survivors report having been arrested, and nearly half of those more than 9 times. And so oftentimes traffickers appoint a person or a female to supervise others and report rule violations, really the right-hand person. In our language, in the streets or in the life, we call it the bottom. But we help instruct victims, collect money, post ads, inflict punishment. And a lot of times with gangs and organized crime, it's moving drugs, money, guns, etc. And so there's not a universal definition for forced criminality, but it's definitely where a trafficked person is forced to undertake a range of criminal activities by the person or trafficker exploiting them. And oftentimes when we think of labor trafficking, it's in reference to like domestic service or agricultural work or entertainment, restaurant service, etc. But forced criminality can fall into the realm of labor trafficking, such as already previously mentioned, the forced sale of drugs. So criminal organizations use force, intimidation, and coercion to pull people into illicit activities. And part of trauma bonding is critical in understanding that when you're reviewing cases in that relationship to their trafficker. And many of the victims of sex trafficking are made more vulnerable due to already being exploited to being targeted for forced criminality. I won't go into the case studies there, but there are many indicators that can be easily missed if one's not paying attention. And there is a trend of charging sex trafficking victims as offenders without ever considering their underlying victimization, including in prostitution. So for me, that's actually me. I personally cycled in and out of our jail and prison system. I went to prison 5 times, spent 10 years collectively behind bars, acquired 8 felonies, nearly all drug related, and while under the oppression of my trafficker. It wasn't until my 9th felony that I was offered access to any meaningful type of services to exit the life or address the root causes of my commercial sexual exploitation or substance use. And so arresting me never got me out of that situation. I was never identified as a victim. And I have 52 pages to prove that, 52 pages of judgment to prove that. And this has huge implications. So, is this your next one?
Okay, this is Megan again, and I am going to just spend some time sharing a research project that I have been a part of at the Avery Center, my organization, and it's super relevant to this because what we were looking at is the intersection of substances and different types of third-party traffickers. So the question that we were looking at is looking at the different types of third-party traffickers and different types of commercial sexual exploitation and how the intersection of substance use may or may not differ between different groups in terms of the recruitment and grooming tactics and how different types of traffickers use substances to maintain control over their victims. So there's 4 different types of trafficking and exploitation that we looked at for this study. Familial controlled, so where a caregiver is exploiting typically a child that's in their care. Gang controlled, where there is more of that organized crime operation occurring, and the victim is typically the property of the gang, not necessarily the property of one specific trafficker, but the network as a whole. Pimp controlled, which there's overlap between gang and pimp control, and I'll touch on that a little bit. But pimp control is typically what a lot of trainings really center awareness on, but it's just one type of third-party trafficker. And I would say it's probably the relatively so the easiest to identify just due to the acceptance of pimp culture in mainstream society. And then we have substance use and survival exploitation, where there may not necessarily be a third party. However, the person with a substance use disorder is engaging in commercial sex acts against their free will through force, fraud, or coercion. So before I continue on to our study, I listed off these 4 different populations of victims and their traffickers, but I also want to really note that there is no hard and fast, clean-cut difference. Exploitation happens on a spectrum. Traffickers do not operate within neat silos of behavior. And so this study was looking at those thematic differences, and there are clear differences. However, I fully want to acknowledge that the themes that I'm sharing do not absolutely apply to every single situation. So this study started back in 2017. Dr. Henderson from the University of Northern Colorado is the co-founder of the Avery Center, and she's a professor of sociology. And so back in 2017, we received some internal grant funding to do a research project, and we were able to invite in 53 females who identified as either currently or previously involved in the commercial sex trade. Each of the interviews that Dr. Henderson conducted with these individuals ranged from 30 to 120 minutes. They were semi-structured interviews, really focused on, first and foremost, what the individual was comfortable with sharing, but also understanding the grooming and recruitment process, the types of exploitation and abuse and experiences during the trafficking or during the time in the commercial sex trade, and then exits for those who identified as completely exited, and barriers for those who were still in the commercial sex trade. Because this interview was a very broad interview and we were looking at a lot of different variables, substance use was just one of the things that some participants outright disclosed, either past or current drug use and abuse. So of those 32, there were 4 familial controlled, 5 gang controlled, 18 pimp controlled, and 5 that identified as survival, substance use driven, or even just as independent adult sex workers. There were, I believe, 2 in our sample who had not had traffickers at any point during their time in the commercial sex trade. So absolutely want to acknowledge that piece as well. Before I get to the results, I want to acknowledge the limitations. Just like with any research project, there's absolutely limitations with this study. So first and foremost was this study represents the experiences of cisgendered females. So male, non-binary, and gender non-conforming individuals were not a part of this sample. This is a really critical place that we need to continue doing research to hear the experiences of folks along all gender identities. Substance use disorder was not the focus of the larger study. It was just one piece of the conversations that developed very organically. So there may be additional experiences from folks that were just simply not included because they did not feel comfortable sharing that during their interview. And then finally, there's 2 theories that we use, and they kind of intersect with each other. So life course theory and stages of change. Life course theory, we're really looking at people identify and understand their surroundings based on where they're at that point in time. So the experiences of somebody who identified as currently in the sex trade is likely going to be very different from somebody who identifies as having successfully exited and are reflecting back on their time in the commercial sex trade. So that's one thing that actually makes this study very dynamic. And then stages of change was originally developed to address and understand how people navigate substance use disorder and long-term sobriety. So the stages of change is cyclical, and it's something that we use within our direct service programming at the Avery Center. And also, similar to life course theory, acknowledges that people are going to identify their experiences and their environment differently based on where they are in the stages of change. So with familial control, so again, familial control typically is a caregiver who exploits a minor who is under their care. In all of the research and direct service provision that I've seen, familial controlled trafficking starts as early as birth. And typically individuals, once they turn 18, are able to escape that situation. Sometimes, because that familial grooming process starts in early childhood, it can completely normalize commercial sexual exploitation. And so we do see sometimes individuals with that introduction through familial trafficking coming under the control of pimp or gang trafficking, or continuing to engage in survival sex after the age of 18 out of a lack of options and having completely normalized that exploitation and trauma. So within familial control, then looking at substance uses specifically, there's two categories that we saw in our study. And I will acknowledge that our subsample for familial was very small. And so further studies need to happen in this area. But what we found were these kind of two subgroups within familial controlled trafficking. The first of which is the caregiver themselves has a substance use disorder, and they sell the child in exchange for basic needs or substances. So this can be to individuals who are paying for sex, or it can be to a drug dealer who is exchanging substances for access to that child's body. And oftentimes within this context, juveniles have an introduction to substances, whether because it's in the home and they have access to those substances, or their caregiver or the drug dealer provides those substances to the child to help sedate them during their exploitation. The second category within the familial control that we saw a theme around was high demand groups. Sometimes this can be referred to as a cultic group or an extremely strict religious group. Just generally within cultic groups and high demand groups, substances are generally forbidden within those communities. And so the survivors that we interviewed for this study that talked about substance uses, they said that those substances were not allowed and they simply did not have access to them. It's important to note that despite the fact that they did not have access to those substances while under familial controlled trafficking, that doesn't mean that they wouldn't later on, after escaping that situation, go on to use substances as a means for coping with the trauma that they had endured. Then we have gang-controlled trafficking. And as we all know, we have drugs, weapons, and humans that gangs move around and sell. It's extremely profitable. One of the unintended consequences of Nixon's war on drugs is a transition from gang members are moving away from selling drugs and weapons to including more human trafficking, because it removes a significant amount of risk for the gang members. That victim can be out generating income. It does not require the gang to re-up on that substance, that product, as frequently, because the product is a human that can be sold repeatedly. With the gang-controlled victims, which again, this was a relatively small piece of our sample, but absolutely some themes emerged here. Gang-controlled trafficking, we heard stories and experiences of kidnapping, stranger abduction, forced drug use, and extremely violent physical abuse by gangs. And with that all comes that substance use piece. So gangs are already selling drugs, and selling humans at the same time provides this triple profit. So the victim themselves has a substance use disorder, and they are purchasing drugs from the gang or exchanging commercial sex acts from the gang for those substances. The victim is being trafficked to individuals outside of the gang, and so those profits are coming back to the gang. And then oftentimes buyers are offered or provided substances as well by the gang or by the victim, and those profits flow back into that organized crime network as well. With gang-controlled trafficking, this was individuals who came under gang-controlled trafficking were more likely within our study to have existing substance use disorders prior to being sex trafficked, which makes sense when you look at the profit component of gang trafficking. So here's just a couple of quotes from the gang-controlled survivors sharing about their experiences with substance use and that forced drug use that I mentioned. So individuals who are under gang control experience significant barriers to exiting that situation due to the brutal force and physical restraint. And then with that substance use disorder, we did see that individuals who entered a gang-controlled situation with an existing substance use disorder, even after they had escaped the gang control, still had significant battles with maintaining long-term sobriety. And then moving on to pimp control. So like I mentioned, with that unintended consequences of Nixon's war on drugs, with gangs moving to including more and more the sale of people, pimp-controlled trafficking was born out of this gang intersection as well. So many traffickers who identify as pimps and use tactics that are categorized as pimp control tactics oftentimes have gang ties in their past. And this again makes sense because individuals who were arrested and convicted for selling drugs or trafficking drugs and weapons, the risk ongoing becomes too high. And so in order to maintain that level of income for that gang member, they transition into pimp-controlled trafficking sometimes. So pimp-controlled trafficking, as I mentioned, is typically the easiest to identify publicly because of the acceptance of pimp culture, and we're very aware of some of the stereotypes around just the term pimp. So in this study, when we looked at the pimp-controlled sample and we had 18 individuals in that subsample, these individuals were overwhelmingly introduced to illicit substances by their pimp, which means that their grooming and recruiting process by their pimp trafficker occurred prior to any substance use or abuse. This was pretty much always introduced socially. So come use these substances with me, come try this with me, let's do this together. This will help you sleep, this will help you feel braver. So very socially introduced over time. What we also heard was very strong themes around emotional and trauma bond driven use. So once that trauma bond was there, the pimp trafficker would use substances to continue to fuel that addiction, not only to the substance, but to the relationship. Withdrawal became leverage for compliance. So an individual who developed a substance use disorder would then enter withdrawals, and oftentimes traffickers use withdrawals as a means of leverage. And then pimps do target individuals who have existing substance use disorders. However, we didn't see this as frequently with a pimp-controlled subpopulation as we did with the gang-controlled. Sometimes it was mentioned several times in those interviews that individuals who had existing substance use disorders, when they were recruited by a pimp trafficker, they were actually, the pimp helped them get clean and then used their sobriety and quote unquote saving them as leverage for that victim to then prostitute for them. So saying, you owe me, I helped you get clean, you owe me. We also saw a lot of pimps that forbid significant substance use. So the occasional social use, to relax and go to sleep, or to feel brave and go out and engage in prostitution. However, many pimps also just flat out forbid it. And ultimately that came down to, one, wanting their victims to be alert and able to engage with sex buyers as safely as possible, and then also cutting into their profit margins. So a lot of pimps that no longer had direct ties to gangs or didn't have ties to gangs to begin with did not want to give their profits over to gangs for those substances to maintain an addiction. So here's several quotes about pimp-controlled survivors, and all of these really highlight that social introduction and those recruitment tactics. Danielle has a statement about helping victims get off drugs first and using that as a part of his recruitment and grooming tactics. So when it comes to survival and substance use disorder-driven prostitution, juveniles who experiment with illicit substances, overwhelmingly in our study, just has been mentioned multiple times in this webinar so far, had significant childhood trauma, and so began experimenting with illicit substances, typically in their teenage years, which then became a full-blown addiction that drove them into sex work and into prostitution. And then on that opposite side, we had individuals who were legal adults when they entered the commercial sex trade, had maybe used substances very socially, very sporadically, and they did not disclose in our interviews a substance use disorder at that time. So to summarize some of these things, that bidirectionality. So addiction can lead to prostitution first and foremost. So somebody who has a substance use disorder will eventually oftentimes have to engage in prostitution to survive financially. Again, they're a very high-risk population and are targeted by traffickers because of those vulnerabilities and the high level of basic needs that they need in order to get through each day. So as you can see, there's some quotes from our interviews there. And then, so that's addiction coming first, and then prostitution coming as a result. And then there's the flip side. So an individual entering prostitution and an addiction coming as a result of seeking out coping mechanisms for the trauma that was being endured. So you can see several quotes here, and these two are by individuals who are currently in the commercial sex trade and talking about how their addiction came to be what it is currently at the time of the interview. And both of them shared that they experienced sex trafficking first, and then were offered substances or forced to take substances, and they found being sex trafficked and having to prostitute, they were able to endure that trauma with the help of substances. So to wrap things up from this study, treatment plans need to acknowledge those root issues. So did the prostitution and sex trafficking come first, or did the substance use disorder come first? And how a treatment plan is developed has to look at that among many other components. Again, understanding that substance use is a coping mechanism for unresolved trauma, and so mental health support, allowing space for the process, processing and healing, talking about experiences, connecting with peers, all of those pieces can help an individual come to understand their trauma, and then that chronological entry into sex trafficking and substance use disorder should be assessed for care management. There is no one size fits all treatment plan or care management plan or a diversion plan within the context of court that fits all victims and survivors of sex trafficking that have a substance use disorder. It really has to be an individualized plan. Okay, handing this off once again.
Great, thanks so much, Megan. So yeah, next we're going to talk about court responses and connections to services. So what does this mean for criminal stakeholders interested in identifying and reducing harm to trafficking survivors? Well, first of all, at the very least, it means that court stakeholders cannot limit their target population just to people facing prostitution charges. If the court truly wants to help survivors of trafficking, they have to understand that they might be coming in on any number of charges, both minor and serious. In addition, court stakeholders should recognize that anyone charged with a drug-related crime could potentially be a survivor of trafficking, even if that crime is connected to a large drug trafficking operation. As Allison and Megan so eloquently discussed, survivors find themselves involved in and in the vicinity of all sorts of crimes, and they are often used as pawns to protect their exploiter from exposure to the criminal legal system. So regardless of the type of crime they are charged with as a result, they are no less deserving of the court's creative interventions, services, and compassion, just as those charged with minor prostitution offenses are. Now, I know we have a lot of service providers and a few public defenders on listening to this webinar, which is wonderful. I encourage you all to talk to your local judges and prosecutors about getting trained on the intersection of drugs and human trafficking so that they will have a better understanding of how drug charges, even serious ones, are in many cases just an indication of how incredibly harsh the circumstances are for the trafficking survivors facing them. Responding with traditional criminal legal responses, such as incarceration, will only further the harm those survivors are experiencing. In addition, while training in trauma and substance use disorders is really important for all court stakeholders, and all court stakeholders should be pursuing this type of training, even with this type of training, court stakeholders still need to always defer to the expertise of service providers in deciding what type of services should be mandated or whether services should be mandated at all. So accordingly, any court trying to respond to the needs of trafficking survivors needs to have a very clear delineation of roles between legal personnel and service providers, and make sure that the service providers are given voice and power and that their expertise are respected. Over to you, Charlotte.
All right, thanks, Zoe. So yeah, to reiterate a little bit what Zoe said, courts should be screening for trafficking and trauma across all charges, right? Not just charges that we think are related to trafficking. And ideally, every court would be using some kind of standardized assessment tool so that, again, we're screening folks uniformly and not like improvising based on the charge or based on our perception of a person. But I also kind of want to make the disclaimer here that it's not important that you get a disclosure of trafficking or some kind of confirmation of trafficking for a couple reasons. So some survivors are not going to identify as having been trafficked, even if they meet that legal criteria. That may not be how they identify, and we don't want to like force that identity or label onto them if it doesn't feel meaningful or true to their experiences. And for other survivors, that kind of disclosure is going to take a long time and a lot of trust. And that's a good thing, right? Like when we think about the intensely vulnerable information that people might be sharing with us, if they're not sharing that with us right away, right, in the first assessment or first couple of sessions that we're meeting with someone, that's not a bad thing. That makes sense that there needs to be a development of a relationship and trust before somebody is sharing that information. And then lastly here, it's really potentially harmful for the courts to try to pull information about somebody's trauma or their trafficking situation from them before they're ready to share, before it's safe, or before we're in a position to then follow through with that information, right? Like, are we then providing long-term trauma counseling or offering resources to help someone get safe? Like, we want to think about what is the purpose of us obtaining this information. And you can still be sort of screening and be mindful and be talking about trauma or providing psychoeducation around trauma without pulling information, right? And when I am meeting with folks, especially like in the first meeting when I'm doing assessment, I always remind people that nothing I ask needs to be answered, right? They could not answer a single thing in the assessment, and that's completely fine. So you always want to make sure that folks know there's no pressure and they're in control of what information they share. All right, so there are things that you can be mindful of that you want to pay attention to and maybe explore, make note to explore as you get to know someone and as you're thinking about their safety. But these are possible indicators. They don't guarantee that somebody has been trafficked. Somebody might have sort of all of these red flags and not have been trafficked. And I think for my work, working directly in the courtroom, it was a constant balance of sort of knowing, being aware, knowing what to look for and thinking about safety a lot, but also not making assumptions about people, right? And I should say my work was with survivors of sex trafficking, so this list is pretty specific to that population. But sort of most obviously, do they have a history of many prostitution arrests or convictions in their rap sheet? Has somebody ever had to engage in survival sex, right? Like, do they ever have to run away from home? Do they ever have to exchange sex for food or shelter? How old were they when that was happening? Something that I think gets missed a lot in substance use assessments is how are you getting income to support your use? Megan had talked about how that, the answer to that may be that they're engaging in sex work, which then presents a sort of greater vulnerability to being exploited. Do they have shelter? What is their living situation like? Is this person like totally exhausted every time you're meeting with them or falling asleep or having to be out all night? And then do they have ID? I would say maybe sort of the biggest like red flag here is if they don't and if somebody else is in possession of their ID, that's definitely very concerning. If someone you're meeting with doesn't have ID, that could be a great place to start working with them, right? If they're not necessarily ready to engage in something else, that's something that I would try to do with folks that I met with is like, let's figure out how we can get you ID, because that can be a complicated process to navigate, and that's a helpful way to provide support. And I'm passing this back to Allison now.
Sorry about that. I'm on mute. And so I think this is critically important in regards to criminal justice responses is the barriers to exiting trafficking. As I mentioned before, the trauma bonding in the use of substance use to strengthen that trauma bond is huge, especially in the direct surface work that I do. Also just uncertainty of the future. For the most part, most of the clients that I work with, it's what they know. And so that uncertainty and fear can be a triggering experience for them, and actually push them further back along that stages of change. Lack of financial resources. As I mentioned before, many have low educational or education. Many haven't graduated high school. They have criminal records, just as myself, even though I did manage to make it to college prior to being trafficked. I still had 8 felonies. And so that even to this very day, 10 years later, working at a national, state, and local level, finding a place to live, getting student loans to get into college. My APR rates are higher on my credit card. Certain car insurances will deny you if you're considered high risk. And that isolation or weakened ties with family support, oftentimes due to trafficking or substance use, or perhaps they never had those as well. And so for me, because I was never identified in our criminal justice system, and that was my entry point for services, instead I cycled in and out of victimization and services. And that is a huge deal and includes, a barrier for exiting trafficking. Oh, sorry about that. Also mandatory versus voluntary. With most of the experiences that I had with connection to services within our criminal justice system, I was mandated healing. So I've been court ordered by judges to get sexual abuse counseling, ordered to be in medication compliance for my mental health issues. Nothing was ever choice-based or strength-based. I had no agency or voice within the process of my service plans or treatment plans. To me, as a person that was sexually abused as a child for an extended period, all my choices were stripped from me, from my family member that abused me as well as my trafficker. And so that mandating of healing and services was very coercive and actually was a deterrent and me deciding not to participate in those type of programs. And in fact, oftentimes I would just return to life and not complete my probation, not complete the services, or if I did complete the services, it was only to be in compliance so that I could remain free. The issue too is that failure to identify VOTs in the criminal justice system or victims can interrupt those services, right, that would address the victim or offender's trauma. Failure to recognize and respond to them, it actually perpetuates this perception that victims or offenders are not entitled to service-based response, and more so fueling that punitive response. So it wasn't until, as I mentioned before, that 9th felony that I had access to services that were choice-based and strength-based. So that one-size-fits-all, unfortunately, most of the individuals that surface in systems, especially our criminal justice system, those systems are ill-equipped for the most part to support individuals with, complex and high needs. It's generally a one-size-fits-all. And for individuals to really be able to engage in those services, it has to be individualized. It has to be gender specific. It has to have integrated responses. I know for me, a person that had been fragmented and disassociated for most of my life due to abuse and complex trauma, the case management was not intensive. It wasn't coordinated. So, individuals are going 3 hours on a bus through the area where they were trafficked in just to get a little sheet of paper to go get an ID. And then when they go get the ID, they can't serve them. All that's really difficult to manage. You're sending a person over here for substance abuse, a person over here for, their mental health issues, over here for their therapy. That's too much for a lot of individuals. Even now, the people that I work with, just navigating those systems is overwhelming all on its own. Also, the anticipation of relapse. So all the, dirty UAs, all those types of things, those are generally approached from our criminal justice system with a punitive approach. And anticipating relapse should definitely be part of these programs. So I think too, for the screening aspect, just understanding the history and other related factors. Does that person have a history of abuse or child welfare involvement, etc. So promising practices. I know I was denied a lot of services that I could have benefited from because I had co-occurring substance abuse and mental health issues. A lot of programs are not, especially like residential treatment or even drug treatment, do not accept individuals with co-occurring issues. Definitely the need for protocols for identifying and assessing individuals for trauma, victimization, and human trafficking. So trauma-informed care, stages of change, which has already been mentioned, and really just absolute criminal justice reform and reentry services, as well as that multidisciplinary response. I know that a lot of specialized courts do have that, and that is, incredibly helpful.
All right, this is Charlotte. I'm going to pick it up here. To kind of reiterate a little bit, charges should not dictate treatment, right? Treatment or services should be based on a comprehensive assessment and a collaborative assessment to understand, what somebody's needs are. So if you are working with someone who has identified that they would like to connect with substance use treatment specifically, things you want to keep in mind. When somebody is first getting sober, they're probably going to feel worse before they feel better, right? If substances were numbing trauma responses, then when they stop using, all of that is going to come up again. And so we need to think through and make sure that somebody has the stability and the appropriate services to be able to identify and practice new coping skills in place of the substance use. And if they don't sort of have that stability, then we need to factor that into the service plan and make sure that they're getting connected with that. Oops, sorry, I'm just trying to switch the slide here. Here we go. All right. So you, of course, want to be talking with a survivor about what they feel they need, right? What do they think would be helpful to them in terms of treatment, and then be able to provide some education around what kinds of options are available. And that's going to look different from state to state and city to city, and depending on what insurance covers. But that might look like inpatient versus outpatient treatment. There's medication-assisted treatment. There's community programs like NA and AA. And you don't need to be an expert on all of these, but it's more around providing choice, right? Because like Allison's slide said, one size fails all, right? So different treatment modalities are going to be effective for different people. And then I just wanted to put a note here based on my experience working in the courts. Typically when somebody came through with multiple drug-related charges, the response from the court was to either mandate or strongly recommend some kind of inpatient or residential treatment program. And I just want to say inpatient is not inherently better or more effective than outpatient, right? There's things that you would factor into an assessment to think about what would be most appropriate. So you want to think about somebody's recovery environment. You might meet with someone who has a history of having been trafficked, but at this time they are not, and they maybe do have a stable place where they can live, and they're not comfortable going to residential treatment, and that might be okay. You might meet with someone who is in crisis and wants substance use treatment, and they might be homeless or living somewhere where there's a lot of active use, and for that person, maybe a residential program is more appropriate. You want to think about, do they have any support systems, and what were their past experiences in treatment like? There's a lot of information there, like what do we already know has been helpful or not helpful in the past. And especially when you're working with trauma survivors and potentially referring to a residential program, you want to be talking about how to prepare for being in an environment where there's like rules and restrictions 24/7. Because one of the defining characteristics of experiencing a trauma is a total loss of power and control in a really tremendously terrible way. And so for some survivors, subsequently being in a situation in which control or power are taken away can be really triggering, right? That can feel intolerable. And so we want to be thinking about that before we just send somebody to a program where there will, you know, in a residential program, there will be like a lot of sort of rules and restrictions in that environment. So a couple other things for courts to keep in mind. So treatment might typically focus initially on the substance use and then gradually move into deeper trauma work as somebody becomes more stable in their recovery. And this is long-term work, right? It takes years. And recovery is really a lifelong process. So this is not something that the court can expect to like see through to the end or have control over. We can't mandate recovery. And it's not helpful to survivors if we're taking that approach, because we're not then really encouraging them to kind of harness their own internal motivation and autonomy in their recovery. And it's not helpful to us either, as folks, you know, service providers or other people working in the courts, if we create unrealistic expectations for the program or for ourselves as professionals. I think you leave a lot of room for burnout there too. And then treatment isn't linear, right? You've heard it many times and it bears repeating that relapse is part of recovery. It's going to happen. And so increasing sentencing or jail time or any other kind of shaming response from the court is totally counterproductive to recovery. I fundamentally believe that shame is not a good motivator. It doesn't work. There's also already like a lot of shame involved in trauma and trafficking, and we don't want to further compound that, right? So there's a real difference between holding someone accountable and shaming them or punishing them. And the best response from the court, if somebody comes back, you know, with a new case or on a warrant or has a relapse, is to be like supportive and welcoming. Like, you're here now. What do we do now? How can we support you, or what do we need to change? Right? And then just another note here for anyone who might be making referrals or looking for places to refer to. When you're looking for programs, you want to think about, of course, what kind of treatment they offer. Are they using like trauma-informed curriculums in the program? And then more broadly, is this a trauma-informed program? So I think that sometimes offering a trauma group or having like some clinicians who are trained in an evidence-based trauma practice can be conflated with being trauma-informed. And while those things are really important, and I don't want to minimize them, when I'm talking about trauma-informed, I mean, like, is the whole staff trained on trauma and trauma responsiveness, right? Including the person at the front desk. Do they take a non-punitive approach to treatment? How do they handle conflict and relapse? Are they emphasizing choice in treatment? And, you know, how are the staff doing, right? Like, are the staff supported? Are there enough staff to provide meaningful services? And then lastly, we want to pay attention to what people who are receiving the services are saying about those services. So one of the best referral sources that I had when I was working in the Bronx came from a woman who was referred to me through the court, but was already in outpatient drug treatment, and really loved that program and had a positive experience there. And it was right by my office, but I didn't know about them. And so through her recommendation, I met with their, you know, director and got to do a site visit and learn more about it, and was able to refer other folks there. So it's really valuable to know what are other survivors or participants saying about this program. And that is all that I have for that section. So I will turn it back over to Zoe.
Great. Thanks so much, Charlotte. And that concludes our webinar. Thank you so much to Charlotte and Allison and Megan for their presentations. If anyone listening has any questions for Allison, Megan, or Charlotte, or they are interested in learning more about MOSAICS training and technical assistance, please do contact us at mosaics@american.edu, and you can learn more about our training and technical assistance on our website. The URL is listed on this final slide here. Thank you all so much for joining us, and we look forward to connecting with you again on our next quarterly webinar. Goodbye.